We want to find out why this hover bike is here.
I don't have no idea why it's there. Like I said, I went in and wanted to look at it to see if there was any foul play involved.
Let me finish my question, and then you can answer, okay?
Stay with her. 22, I'm in pursuit.
The PlayStation was an incredibly important point in the history of gaming. It led the charge for home consoles to embrace 3D graphics and CD media. The controllers and games we play today can all be traced back to Sony's first foray into home gaming.
Freeze right there!
Ken Kutaragi is the man most responsible for bringing the PlayStation to life. Now, this story begins way back when Kutaragi, while working with Sony, secretly, yes secretly, developed the Super Nintendo sound hardware. Now, many of Kutaragi's bosses were angered by his covert op, but he received enough support to retain his position. He continued to coordinate with Nintendo, pitching the idea of a CD attachment for the SNES. Now, Nintendo's think tank was against CDs. They figured the frustrating load times outweighed any potential gameplay advantages, and we saw them make good on that philosophy with the N64. Kutaragi was eventually allowed to develop a Nintendo PlayStation prototype as long as it remained completely separate from the SNES and the cartridge format. Kutaragi found support from the founder of Epic Sony Records, Shigeo Maruyama, who provided most of the details to this particular story, and really only went along with Kutaragi's console idea as a way to get karaoke into the home. Karaoke on demand wasn't available yet in Japan, and Maruyama saw a CD console as the perfect way to do it. Kutaragi was known as a very ambitious and at times eccentric man. Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa warned Nintendo's Japanese HQ to rein in Kutaragi for fear of him taking too much power.
Not Plumber Boy, the Bandicoot will come. I'm coming to get you, pal. Hi, how are you? Am I on the right street? Can you tell me where Nintendo is? People run a lot here. This is really nice. Plumber Boy, your time has come.
The deal that changed gaming. There are various accounts of how this went down. Many report that Sony and Nintendo had intended to announce their PlayStation at CES 1991 until Nintendo pulled the rug out. Sony announced the deal as planned, while Nintendo proclaimed the next day they would be working with Philips instead. Others state the deal was reworked and Nintendo had intentionally protracted negotiations to slow Sony's eventual launch of their own machine. Most stories do report that Nintendo was upset with how much ownership Sony would retain over the games. A quick look at how Nintendo has always valued their first-party games and struggled with third parties from the N64 era on lends support to this theory. Kutaragi wisely used the collapse of this deal to support his project. Maruyama accounted for how Kutaragi gained the final push for his machine. Kutaragi had begun stirring up trouble in the company. He even came up to Mr. Oga and said Sony's very own Norio Oga gave his approval, but the project got canned for no reason. If you back out now, how will you maintain your honor? And Mr. Oga responded, "You are right. This has brought us shame."
Hey, Plumber Boy, Mustache Man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. These are numbered.
I'm gonna have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot. It's an Australian name.
Many at Sony were not convinced that home gaming was the way to go, so much so that Kutaragi and his team were moved from the Sony HQ to Sony Music. This was to sidestep the opposition and work on their project without interference. The choice to focus on 2D or 3D visuals was a large one and had a huge impact on gaming moving forward. In hindsight, it seems ludicrous that gaming would remain in 2D, but at the time, it wasn't a simple decision. 2D was at its peak, producing gorgeous sprites that looked far more polished than the clunky early-gen polygons. Virtua Fighter's massive success in the arcades was the tipping point and pushed Sony to choose hardware that could handle 3D visuals. Ironically, Sega, although they created Virtua Fighter and influenced PlayStation to head in a 3D direction, they still insisted on their Saturn focusing on producing the best possible 2D visuals and simple polygons, like the kind seen in Virtua Fighter and Virtual Racing. Sega's mistake was failing to anticipate how fast 3D technology would evolve, as they struggled to keep pace with the PlayStation moving forward. Multi-platform polygonal games almost always looked and ran better on Sony's console. In a bizarre twist, the tech that enabled the N64 to produce the best 3D visuals of the generation was initially offered to Sega. Sega of America had recommended to Sega of Japan to use this chip, but some say Sega of Japan had never given up the resentment of Sonic and the Genesis not doing as well in Japan as they did in North America. This led them to ignore the ideas coming from North America and focus on 2D visuals. Now, the legendary SCE, Sony Computer Entertainment, was formed in 1993 and was soon approached by EA and Namco to make games. Both companies were lured by the promise of lower production costs compared to cartridges and higher storage capacity compared to cartridges. Sony was also proactive in working with third-party developers. They provided programming information that was constantly updated and invested in tech support teams to help development. Nintendo, on the other hand, cranked out fabulous first-party games, but seemed to leave third parties to fend for themselves. Some, like Rare, were able to produce top-notch products like GoldenEye, but many others struggled or didn't bother. Now, the first E3 was a monumental moment in the war between Sega and Sony. A few months before E3, Sega had stated they would release the Saturn September 1995 on Saturn Day. But in order to beat Sony to the market, they announced at E3 1995, in July, they had already shipped 30,000 units to the biggest retailers. They announced that the console would cost $399 and include a copy of Virtua Fighter. But this burned a few bridges with other retailers that were taken by surprise and weren't included. This caused Sega to be dropped by KB Toys. Now, how did Sony respond to this? In quite possibly the best ever E3 presentation, and most certainly the briefest, Sony walked up to the podium and did this.
$299.
Since Sega had rushed the Saturn to market, they had fewer games at launch than Sony, although a case could be made that Sega still had the stronger lineup with Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, Panzer Dragoon, and Clockwork Knight headlining the group. Sony, on the other hand, tried to provide a game in every genre, and they had quality games like Toshinden, Ridge Racer, Rayman, Raiden Project, and NBA Jam Tournament Edition, among the rest. Namco had also created a PlayStation-friendly arcade board, which led to great ports of both Ridge Racer and Tekken. The following year, Nintendo came in with easily the smallest launch lineup in console history, as they could only manage the wonderful Mario 64 and the very good Pilotwings 64. Now, in terms of marketing, Sega was aiming a little higher at adults with more mature themes, and they even advertised in Playboy. Now, Sony, on the other hand, directed all of their focus at teenagers. Their philosophy was that younger kids had always aspired to be older and would want to act like teenagers, and that when adults played games, they would regress to a state of feeling like they were 17 again. Sony would use a lot of colorful, edgy themes for their commercials, and even the memory card UI had what looked like sprays of graffiti. In Europe, the PlayStation was very successful, especially in the UK, outselling the Saturn 3-1. They also outspent Sega $20 million to $4 million in terms of marketing in that region. This was an important step, as home consoles had not really caught on in the UK, as most gamers preferred to use PCs. This is why most British gamers still call them computer games, while we generally call them video games. Although Sony started off doing very well against Sega, the 5th generation still got off to a very rocky start. Many analysts even predicted a second video game crash, as this 5th generation was flooded with consoles similar to the first crash. The Atari Jaguar, Panasonic 3DO, Amiga CD32, FM Towns Marty, Neo Geo CD, PC FX, they were all after a piece of the pie. The 3 leaders after the 1995 Christmas buying season were the PlayStation, Saturn, and 3DO, but sales were unexpectedly poor, even failing to outsell the previous generation. Nintendo had faced many delays with their N64, and they didn't launch until 1996. Sony had gained a significant lead over the Saturn by then, and it came down to a 2-horse race. Nintendo's cartridges pushed several publishers away due to memory constraints and higher costs of development. A CD could hold 680 megabytes, while cartridges ranged from 4 to 32 megabytes, with only Resident Evil 2 and Conker's Bad Fur Day reaching 64 megabytes. Most notably, this led to Square switching the release of Final Fantasy VII to Sony's console, selling 9.8 million copies, the second highest PS1 seller of all time. CDs allowed for large files like sound, FMV, detailed textures, and pre-rendered backgrounds. The hours of voiceover in Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil, the licensed soundtracks of Wipeout XL, and the epic scope of Final Fantasy VII could only be done on a CD. The downside was that the PlayStation could only hold a small amount of information and had to constantly load new chunks from the disc, causing frequent load times. Nintendo's cartridges had 0 load times and were more durable, but sound had to be compressed and many features had to be left out. This made it difficult to port some games from the PlayStation to the N64, but when working within the strengths of their own hardware, Nintendo was able to produce stunning games. Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time are fantastic examples of using flat polygons to create beautiful worlds and characters. Nintendo's mantra in this time was quality over quantity, but it would be incorrect to assume Nintendo had unmatched highs while Sony relied on an army of mediocrity. Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart, GoldenEye, Smash Bros., and even the better Aki wrestling games were certainly some of the best of the generation. While Sony had a lower average of quality due to the sheer amount of titles released, they could still match, if not surpass, the amount of high-end games with Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9, Gran Turismo, Tekken, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, had that exclusive first, Final Fantasy Tactics, and many more. PlayStation's lower cost of development and third-party friendly philosophy also led to more experimentation and variety. After the 5th generation's sluggish start, the PlayStation went on to become the first home console to sell over 100 million units. It settled in at 102.49 million for 4th all-time on the list, behind the PS2 at 155 million, the Nintendo DS at 154 million, and the Game Boy and Game Boy Color at a combined 118 million. Sony's first attempt at a console was a gigantic success that helped bring gaming into the mainstream. The PlayStation reached a broader audience and helped legitimize gaming as a hobby and passion for people of all ages. It cannot be overstated that every console controller today owes its design to the DualShock. The games may look clunky now, but many of the franchises that started on the PS1 were groundbreaking and are still around today. 3D gaming is a brave new frontier, and both Sony and Nintendo were instrumental in how 3D gaming would evolve. It's also interesting that after the PS2 refined the strengths of the PS1 and went on to be the all-time bestseller, that the PS3 would get so far away from what made the first two so strong. Instead of developer-friendly hardware and an approachable price, the PS3 used powerful but difficult architecture and launched at a ludicrous $699 in the US. It still came around to sell 80 million though. Sony wised up with the PS4, but it goes to show how difficult it can be to get a console right. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you could share it with someone you know that might like it too. You can find me on Twitter at GameThinkTalk, and you can find more articles just like this at a90skid.com. Bye for now.